Hello everyone, in this video I will explain about active and passive voice in academic writing. The usage of active versus passive voice is often a source of confusion in academic writing. While some writers argue against the use of passive voice in academic writing, but others claim it should be used liberally. Traditionally, the passive voice was used in a scientific writing, but in recent times there has been a shift from this trend, with journals and editors increasingly showing a preference for the active voice. So what should authors do then? Should they depart from tradition and stop using the passive voice completely? So which is preferable, the active or the passive voice? Choosing between the active and passive voices is sometimes a matter of style and depends on what you want to emphasize in a sentence. This presentation will help you understand the difference between the active and passive voices, why the active voice is preferred in research writing, when the passive voice should be used, and which voice is preferable in each section of a manuscript. Here is where the presentation begins. Active voice refers to a sentence format that emphasizes the doer of an action. For example, the authors conducted experiments on planetary gear trains, while passive voice is the action being performed is emphasized, and the doer may be omitted. For example, experiments were conducted on planetary gear trains. In this construction, the phrase by the authors can be omitted, which means that the reader already knows or does not need to know who the doer is. Only the action is important. Until recently, it was the norm to use passive construction in scientific writing. The passive voice lends an impersonal tone to the writing, which was perceived to be more objective and formal. Traditionally, this tone was considered favorable for scientific writing, and others were advised to strictly avoid using the active voice, especially the use of first-person references such as I, we, my, and our in their academic research papers. If you compare the two examples below, you will see the passive voice sounds impersonal and therefore more formal than the active. Here are the examples for you. The first sentence. In this study, we numerically analyzed the thermal responses of WEDM wire electrodes using a finite element model. Second sentence. In this study, a finite element model was used to numerically analyze the thermal responses of WEDM wire electrodes. However, passive constructions can make the text more wordy and difficult to understand, especially when in long sentences. Using active voice definitely makes the sentences less wordy, more readable, and easier to understand. That is the reason why many authorities are uh, going against these traditional um, notions and encouraging the use of the active voice. With a few academic papers should be easy to read and understand. Here are some generic guidelines that will make it easier for you to decide when to use the active voice and when to use the passive voice. When is the active voice preferable? First, it improves readability. It is direct clear, concise, and improves readability. Compare these two sentences. In passive form, the hardness impact velocity relation was significantly affected by the increased indenture mass. In active form, it will be increased indenture mass significantly affected the hardness impact velocity relation. Second, when it emphasizes author responsibility. Another argument in favor of using the active voice is that it emphasizes author responsibility. Using the passive voice often makes it unclear who is responsible for the action or the doer. Here are the examples. In the passive form, no attempt was made to comprehensively investigate the material properties as it was beyond the scope of the present study. In active form, the sentence will be, we did not attempt to comprehensively investigate the material properties as it was beyond the scope of the present study. Thus, the active voice is more appropriate when you wish to emphasize a decision that you took as authors of a study. The last one, when it journals prefer the active voice. Most journals in their submission guidelines instruct authors to use the active voice in their manuscripts as they feel that the active voice would help readers comprehend the subject matter of the paper more easily. So you must follow the instruction from the journals. Now, when is the passive voice preferable? First, when the recipient is the main focus. The passive voice is generally used when you wish to emphasize the person or thing acted on. For instance, when referring to your main topic, as in the following example. In active form, the sentence will be, in 1921, researchers at the University of Toronto discovered insulin. It is still the only treatment available for diabetes. Let's see the sentence in passive form. Insulin was first discovered in 1921 by researchers at the University of Toronto. It is still the only treatment available for diabetes. So the passive again shows the main focus, which is insulin in that sentence. Second, when the action is more important. When discussing an experimental procedure, the focus is on what was done, not on who did it. For example, the solution was first heated to 120 degrees Celsius for approximately 20 minutes and then allowed to cool to room temperature. Now let's see what happens if the same sentence is written in the active voice. We first heated the solution to 120 degrees Celsius for approximately 20 minutes and then we allowed it to cool to room temperature. The importance of the action getting decreased when the sentence changes into active form. Third, to avoid repetition, using the passive voice can at times help avoid repetition and add a variety. For example, consider these sentences. We dissolved the sodium hydroxide in water. Then we titrated the solution with hydrochloric acid. In these sentences, it is obvious that the researcher is doing the dissolving and titrating. Therefore, the doer is not important. Moreover, using the active voice would mean beginning every sentence with I or we. This would sound rather repetitive and monotonous. Therefore, the passive voice is better choice here. For example, sodium hydroxide was dissolved in water. The solution was then titrated with hydrochloric acid. Here is the usage of active versus passive voice in different sections of a manuscript. Let's focus on active voice first. In introduction and discussion sections, the active voice is especially useful in the introduction and discussion sections of your manuscript, where you discuss previous research and then introduce your own. So you will use your sentence gonna be direct, concise, and readable. For example, previous studies have investigated contact behaviors resulting from dynamic loading. In this study, we investigated the effect of stiffness on contact behavior. Note how using the active voice in the second sentence helps the reader make a clear mental transition from previous studies to the present study. Now, in the literature review section, in this section of a paper often seeks to delineate the most important contributions in the field, which makes actors or agents or authors important. Here is the example. Nobri et al. 1997 studied the surface-resistant characteristics of ductile steel to impact indentations by hard alumina balls. In the passive, will it be the surface-resistant characteristics of ductile steel to impact indentations by hard alumina balls were studied by Nobri et al. And a bit longer than before. Go on to passive voice. In a section of manuscript, it will be used in method sections. The passive voice is often preferred in the materials and method section where the steps taken are more important than the doer or actor. Consider the following example. We obtained the velocity counter lines from CFD simulations. In the passive, it will be more great. The velocity counter lines were obtained from CFD simulations. In this case, it's more important to emphasize what was done rather than who did it. Therefore, the passive voice is preferable here. And then in results section, the passive voice is also preferable when describing the results of a study, as the presentation of results calls for objectivity. Here is the example. An inverse relationship was observed between the pressure ratio and exergy loss in combustion chamber. In summary, both the active and passive voices can be appropriate choices in scientific or academic writing. It is important to consider what you are trying to emphasize in a particular sentence or section of your paper. Your guiding principle should be clarity. Think about what information the target reader is looking for and choose the active voice or the passive voice, whichever will make the text most clear and comprehensible. If you write, keeping this in mind, and no journal reviewer will need to give you feedback about the active and passive voice. Thanks.